Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a Friday Reads for books that I've read. Michael Winkler, Australian author. This is called Grimmish. Stanislau Lem, Polish sci-fi writer, called the Cyberiad. Translated by Michael Campbell with a K. Venom by an author from Thailand called Saneh Sangsuk. And this was translated by Mui Pupok Sakul. Apologies. And then a couple of non-fiction books. Hayley Campbell, All the Living and the Dead. And Gustav Janusz, Conversations with Kafka. But I'm not going to talk about this today because the book I'm currently reading is called Is That Kafka? 99 Findings by German biographer Rainer Stack. So I'm going to do a Kafka special on these two in a separate video. Okay, so let's start with the Grimmish. And the first thing to say is I love this. 5 stars. In its own content, it says this is exploding non-fiction, which sort of veers it into the world of fiction. And indeed, the very sort of beginning of the book, in the inside flap, is a review of the book. And that reminded me of Cameron McCabe's 1940s book called Face on the Cutting Room Floor. I'll post a link to my review of that. But the second part of that book, the first part is a straightforward sort of detective thriller sort of plot. And then sort of part 2 is a sort of postmodernist sort of take on the fact that the lead character was called Cameron McCabe and the author was called Cameron McCabe. And there are all these reviews for the book, which actually reviews for other sort of classic detective fiction, which he has sort of inserted the name Cameron McCabe or the book title in place of what the original work was being reviewed, as a sort of jumping off point for a discussion of the state of detective fiction in 1940s. It was in a way, it was a book that looked to be the detective fiction to end all detective fiction. And in a way, I think this might have similar ambitions, the sort of non-fiction biography to blow up and end sort of, you know, the illusion that biography is non-fiction. It isn't. It's fiction. It's a narrative. It's somebody's subjective, even if well researched. It's somebody's subjective take on somebody else, and we can never be inside somebody else's head unless the technology evolves. Anyway, all that's by the by. So the biography is of a boxer from Philadelphia called Joe Grimm, who goes over to Australia in 1908 and does a tour of boxing matches throughout the major conurbations of Australia. And his specialty is that no one can knock him out. They can put him down, but he feels no pain. And when he was in America, he fought with several boxers who went on to be world champions, not sure what the weight is, including the first black champion, Johnson, but several other, highly talented boxers. They all beat him, but none of them could put him down, and he had this reputation. But by the time he got to Australia, he was more of a punching bag, that he didn't put up any resistance. He himself didn't box to try and win anymore. I mean, he did win some fights back in the US, but by the time he got to Australia, it wasn't about resisting, it wasn't about landing your own blows. It was just about sucking up the punishment. And he became a bit of a freak show because people, A, couldn't believe how much punishment he took. B, there was always the chance that this could be the night that he actually goes down and doesn't get back up. But they were all very one-sided fights. And it's basically following him around in the guise of this guy who latches onto him, who's an Australian, who in the current day is talking with his nephew, I think, who is either Michael Winkler or a Michael Winkler stand-in. And all he wants for his storytelling, he's a bit of a male Scheherazade, is just to be kept his glass filled up with sherry, which his nephew duly provides. So his uncle, as a young man himself, back in 1908, is following around Joe Grimm on his tour and is relaying all the stories. Now, there's a third character on that tour, which is a talking goat, which sounds very odd, but it's part of this whole metafictional element, whereby the uncle is probably, not a real. I mean, obviously, this is biography, this is non-fiction, but you pretty soon realise that the uncle is not a real person in the here and now, in sort of 21st century, probably wasn't a real person following around Joe Grimm. I assume Joe Grimm probably was a real person, but then we've got the talking goat just to disabuse us of the reliability of these eyewitness accounts. And then you realise that the nephew, who may or may not be Michael Winkler, we get a lot of sort of metafictional, confessional stuff for him as to what it's cost him to knock all this source material into this book. So it starts off as a fairly straight biography, lots of newspaper reportage from the time about the bouts and things, but increasingly the metafictional elements take over. And I just think it's wonderfully done. It's a meditation, obviously, on sort of male violence, but it's also about sort of the nature of endurance and spiritual. Is there a spiritual element to it? The nature of pain versus what if you don't feel pain? And I'm just going to read certain sections to illustrate this. So this is referring to a bout in 1962, which Norman Mailer actually wrote about, where one of the boxers dies. And unfortunately, that footage is still available online, that you can watch a man dying. And if you watch the footage, nothing untoward or unusual happens in the bout. It's a standard boxing bout. It just so happens that one of the guys in it died. When the combat sport fan witnesses a one-sided beatdown, it exposes the uncomfortable extent to which we are voyeurs as well as spectators. Makes it much harder to hide from that dirty secret. It is not uncommon for people to die from single punches. Grimm withstood hundreds of blows every fight. He was a one-off, the ultimate boxing outlier, but his métier was resilience rather than resistance. He absorbed and he accepted. Also, the pain he endured was a choice, and I think there is a difference between the pain you choose to endure and the pain you do not choose but must endure. Or is there? If you are choosing to endure pain, can that ever be a real choice? Must this willing acceptance by definition be impelled by something else so powerful that choice is an illusion? The internal contradictions being that if you are rationally submitting to pain, you are demonstrating your lack of rationality. So it's asking the question of Joe Grimm, who does end up in an insane asylum. His behaviour gets more and more odd. Is his brain just basically turned to mush by taking so many blows, and that's why he goes mad? Or is his madness already there because he's accepted this choice in life to be a human punch bag? Is that so sort of beyond the pale and insane that it would suffice as a definition of madness in and of itself? So there's lots of sort of metaphysical questions about that. But what I find so clever in this book is increasingly the metafictional elements come to the fore, and in a way, as Joe Grimm slides back into obscurity, we get these questions that Michael Winkler, or the Michael Winkler character, raises, which I think are really, really pertinent. So he's talking about sort of Australian masculinity, bush people from the bush, people from who are sort of miners, and there's a scene, a brilliant scene, where they're in some sort of cowpoke town. They go to the pub, and there's a headbutting contest, a very highly organised headbutting contest with knockout rounds and everything. And Grimm and the uncle watch this in sort of fascination. And it's obvious that, Grimm would win this because he can't feel pain, that he would keep butting. But Grimm keeps refusing to do it, even though they need someone that sort of hasn't recovered from a previous earlier round. And they need someone to fill his place, and Grimm refuses to do it unless he's paid. For him, he takes all this punishment in the boxing ring for money, and if he's not going to be remunerated, then he's not going to do it. And, that scene about sort of literally mindless violence, where you're beating your head against another head into insensibility, is just so brilliantly done. But he's talking about how now, also the uncle, when he was growing up in sort of fairly rural villages where there was sort of, no diversity, no one dared admit, if they were gay or anything. It was completely sort of homogenous masculinity, and that these guys could take their own form of punishment and went into Australian rules football and became local town heroes. And Winkler comes back to him saying, there were other people displaying courage in that town. The courage to express views outside the conservative and sometimes redneck norm. The courage of those few adults and students at my school who made a point of chatting to the kid with an intellectual disability when no one else would give him any attention except through bullying. The courage of those who proselytised for their religion, however wrong-headed, and were persecuted for it. The courage of those who were not interested in football and said so. But even though I saw this with my eyes, I did not compute it properly as courage at the time. After all, none of them was going to take a pack mark at centre half-back, which is an Australian football term. So he's saying that the traditional notions of heroism and sort of masculine courage are completely outmoded and redundant today. That resistance, which is what Joe Grimm wasn't really doing, he was enduring, is not, is done by an active assertion of, one's sort of identity and point of view against the majority. And he also talks about a cross-country race that he ended up winning, where they were running in, it was the only sporting triumph he had, the only time he could regard himself as a hero, except it was tainted. So the race was held in the teeth of a gale, and it was just too physically difficult for his classmates, who were normally superior runners to him. But because he was a farm boy, used to hoiking great sort of fence posts around, he had the stamina to keep going. And it's him and another guy are nearing the finishing line. But even he couldn't do, he quit basically, and sort of walked across the line. What he didn't realise, he assumed that he'd be overtaken by the other guy, but actually the other guy had given up a split second earlier. So he won the race, but he himself is the only one who knows that actually he quit, and that his sort of heroism and courage were deeply flawed at the time. And just one other final thing. So I notice, I said to my uncle, that you're rampaging about in rural and remote Australia without ever encountering a First Nation person. I'm a little surprised. I'm surprised you're surprised, he said. But, for what it's worth, over time I have developed a suite of opinions about black and white Australia, and some of them might be correct. One of those opinions is that the damage done to Indigenous people by blatant racists may be roughly equivalent to the damage done by patronising do-gooders. Another is that the whitefellow lust for those things that belong to Aboriginal people knows no bounds. My mob, non-Indigenous Australians, are almost crazed with a desire for their art, their law, their blessing, their music, their knowledge, access for the rapacious academic researchers who descend from every corner to probe and prod and provoke and ponder and proclaim to questionable effect. And most of all their go on, forget about it forgiveness that could ease the new and true white man's burden, which is that we live in full knowledge that all comfort and amenity of life in this land was and is pinched from those who were here longer and better. And you fix that by writing a book about Aboriginal characters? I am not comfortable as a non-Indigenous writer to invent an Aboriginal people, language, culture. But I also think it is deeply problematic for me to use people that I know and manipulate their stories or their words for the purposes of fiction. Australians like me have stolen and continue to steal a lot from Aboriginal people, and at the very least I can avoid stealing their stories, so I avoid it respectfully, while being aware that this becomes one more contribution to whitewashing. It's those sorts of decisions he's making as a writer, what to include, what not to include, what to embellish, what not to embellish. He also talks about how there are no women in the book, and so he inserts a one woman in the book. These are decisions I've also referred to in my current book, The Death of the Author in Triplicate. I think these are important decisions. Now, of course, most authors go through the thought processes, but they don't set down those thought processes on paper. Michael Winkler, like me, and like Laurent Binet in HHHH, we show our workings. And this very much reminded me of Binet's HHHH. It's one of my favourite books of all time, where a historian who is writing history is constantly, reflexively trying to decide between what is pure history and what are his sort of contemporary day sort of insertions of his own matrix of values and culture that shouldn't really be there. And I think this book does it brilliantly. It's so clever. It's a as I say, a lot of the early stuff is fairly straight-laced biography about a boxer in 1908, but actually even that was gripping in itself, and then the book just explodes with all the sort of metaphysical stuff and also the reflective authorial stuff. Wonderful, 5 stars. And on to Stanislau Lem, the Cyberiad. So I've read quite a few books by Lem. This is definitely Lem at play. This is very playful, lots of puns, which is, the translator does well to preserve. It's basically the cosmos is made up of sort of robots and automatons and those of organic flesh. And there are 2 main characters in here themselves, both sort of automatons, but they're great inventors. They can construct automata to do anything. And this is a series of short stories in a sort of fable way of how these 2, they're called constructors, go about the universe and encounter kings and princes and princesses. It's very fable, very folklorish in style, but with this sort of overlay of sort of technology and sort of a bit of science, such as on DNA and things like that. But the science is worn lightly and is often played up for laughs. Sometimes the constructors get the shit kicked out of them for their presumption. Other times it's the kings who get the shit kicked out of them for their presumption. So it's very much, bursting the balloon of people who with sort of jumped up ideas about themselves. It's very playful. It's so far removed from Solaris, which is just a fantastic book about metaphysics. But it's fine, it's light. If you just want an entertaining diversion read, I would say this. There are lots of stories in a section called The 7 Sallies of Trawl and Clapausius, who are the 2 constructors. And most of them are sort of 10 to 15 pages long. But then you get to one called the Tale of the 3 Storytelling Machines of King Genius, which is 70 pages long. And that's the only time that this book really lagged for me. I think when he kept it short and punchy and fable-like, that really worked for me. But that one long section was a bit of a drag. So I gave this, I think, 4 stars. And on to a novel from Thailand by Saneh Sangsuk. This is set in rural Thailand, where I think all of his books are set. He's very well known within Thailand. I was just interested in sampling them. And it's very charming. So a young boy who has destroyed his arm when he fell out of a tree, when he was doing what he was told not to do. So he only has one functioning arm. And of course, because that's having to do everything and compensate for the lack of the other one, it's incredibly muscular. And he has an enemy within the village who's always trying to sort of do him down, but he's living under the protection of his mother and father, so he has some protection. Anyway, it's a very short book, but the core of the story is he ends up in a face-off with a king cobra, which are sort of deadly venomous, hence the title. And the cobra goes to him and he manages to grab its neck to stop it biting him, but the cobra coils itself around his arm. But because he's sort of supernaturally strong, the cobra, and he are locked in a sort of mortal combat of constriction. The boy around the cobra's throat, the cobra just trying to squeeze the boy to death, and they're going throughout the sort of the environs in this sort of titanic struggle. And yeah, I'm not going to spoil how it ends, other than say that with my writing hat on, I actually came up with a very alternative ending. But anyway, I'm not from Thailand, I'm not from that culture, who am I to quibble? But I thought it was a really enjoyable, quick read, nice sort of insight into sort of rural Thailand. 4 stars. And on to Hayley Campbell, All the Living and the Dead. I saw this on Guilty Feet's chapter, and long-time viewers may know I read almost anything about death as I try and grapple, not with what I call third-person death, which leaves grief and bereavement in those left behind. I'm interested in first-person death, You know, what is death? How does its shadow cast itself on our lives that may influence or change our behaviour? And indeed, my next book that I've almost finished writing is about that very subject. So this was like, you know, catnip to me. Of course I was going to read it. Now, Hayley Campbell, she's Australian. Her father is a graphic artist who worked with Alan Moore on the Jack the Ripper graphic novel. I can't remember what it was called. Was it just called Jack? Anyway, so she was exposed as a child to some very sort of gruesome images around death. And in a way, though it was completely unintentional, it's a form of abuse, because at what point, and she raises this point, at what point does a child get introduced to death? Now, sort of circumstance could mean that if a grandparent dies or a pet dies when you're very young, you get exposed to death. But in her case, she didn't have these early examples of death. So it's really exposure to her father's working that she saw. So I think that is a sort of, you know, it's like, what age do you introduce your child to spicy food? Well, if you give them spicy food at age 3, that's probably abusive. Whereas if you introduce it to them as early teens, that's possibly less so. Anyway, she then talks about sort of, you know, the image of Christ on the cross, and sort of, you know, she was raised Catholic, but she very much rebelled against that because she felt it wasn't, you know, the Christ on the cross is not a true representation of death, what death is. It didn't speak to her about death. And that's the introductory chapter, and I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was very eye-opening. So in her pursuit to try and sort of, you know, confront what death is, she talks to people in the death industries in various roles: a funeral director, a director of anatomical services, a death mask sculptor, a disaster victim identification for things like plane crashes and things like that. And you know, they're interesting enough monographs, but I felt, well, yeah, these are people who deal with the dead, but they're not really confronting their own mortality. And she's very impressed that their major motivation is to preserve the dignity of the dead. So in a way, it's a sort of reverse grieving process, that they are maintaining the illusion and minimising the upsetting nature of these dead people. So I didn't feel that was really an engagement with death as that I was interested in. Then we come to a crime scene cleaner in America, and she's really upset with him because he's not about sort of preserving the dignity of the dead, because of course the dead are no longer there. They're probably already underground. He's clearing up the house where there's blood everywhere or whatever it is, or someone has died of old age and sort of liquefied because into the carpet because no one's discovered them for ages. So he's doing that for profit for his company, but also so the house could be sold and someone who has rights to the house can make money out of that. And she's sort of very annoyed with him that he doesn't have the purity of motive that the previous did, which I found troubling, really. I don't think, I mean, as an individual she has the right to feel that, but I don't think as an author she has the right to feel that. So I was troubled with that. And then we go back to people who are directly dealing with dead bodies, an embalmer, an anatomical pathology technologist, and this is on page 149 of, not counting the notes, 237, so just under 100 pages to go. And she sees an image there of a dead baby who's been autopsied and is now going to be prepared for burial by being sewn back together and washed and all of that. And the baby is put in a sink full of soapy water and is sort of bobbing around. And not unreasonably, she finds it an immensely troubling image. She can't get out of her head. It is traumatic. It's the one image that she's seen in all her travels that has pushed her over the edge, and she can't shake it. You know, it's with her all the time, it's in her dreams, etc., 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 which is entirely understandable. But I think the point is everyone would have their image to push them over the edge into trauma. But it infects the subsequent ones of a bereavement midwife, and a grave digger, and a crematorium operator. All the time she's referring back to this image, which rather taints what we're getting, you know, about these people. And again, it's about her trauma. It becomes about her trauma and her grief at this image, not about the experience of death. I will say that the chapter about a bereavement, what's she called, a bereavement midwife, is brilliant. And I went online because you know that midwife works in the Midlands in the UK, and I saw one of her videos. I mean, she's so, as described in here, she's so incredibly sympathetic. She's a wonderful human being. So that was, you know, it was good reading about that. But overall, this doesn't enlighten you at all about death. It enlightens you about death practices and how we handle dead bodies and things like that. But that's not what I'm looking for. So I was really disappointed in this. 3 stars. And that's it. As I say, I've got the 2 Kafka books, which will be in my next video. Conversations with Kafka, which I've finished, just to let you know that, remarkably, a 17-year-old would-be poet befriended Kafka because the poet's father worked in the same office, and the father sort of got Kafka to read over his poems, and they formed I say friendship, it was really Kafka was a mentor, not a writing mentor, a life mentor. So it's this guy, Gustav Janusz, his writing down everything that Kafka said to him in their conversations, particularly their walks. And that's what this book is made of. And then Rainer Stack has written the definitive biography of Kafka in several volumes. And this book has all the little bits of information he found that tug at our established or pre-established notion of Franz Kafka as neurotic, sickly, introverted. He's trying to suggest that these sort of little clues that he digs up suggest that it's not such a straightforward picture. I haven't read Stack's biography of Kafka, so I don't know if these are also in there or not as part of a much wider narrative, or whether they're the sort of odds and endments that couldn't actually fit in there. So I'll be talking about these 2 books in my next video. Till then, thanks very much.